which lies beyond civilization. Weird.
The weird and the eerie.
Say, for instance, Britain is very keen on the revolution going behind the Iron Curtain, you know, but British people have always been, it seems to me, dedicated to giving all the freedoms away. Like, they're all sort of lecturing about bloody Romania and Russia and that, and yet they're British people are always dedicated to, you know, giving all their basic freedoms away, the freedoms which my generation's fought for, which all my grandfather fought for. And they're just like, all Parliament seems to meet to do is to give our basic freedoms away, our civil rights and everything.
Top. You think it's the pipes, but it turns on the lights. The City Hall Goblins. The City Hall Goblins. A Polaroid is a home home goblin. And the next song ready. The City Hall Goblins.
All right, we are back. And we are in the studio for another episode of Lost Futures, a Mark Fisher podcast. And I'm Steve.
And I'm Marlowe. And play that clip of Al Pacino saying, just when I thought I was out, they dragged me back in. Because we're talking about fucking post-punk again, baby.
Yes, so today we're talking about The Fall, the band that we all know and love and that Mark Fisher wrote thousands of words about.
And we will be covering very few of those words, because some of them were in this chapter, most of them were not.
Yes, in The Weird and the Eerie, the third chapter, Body, a Tentacle Mess, the Grotesque and the Weird, the Fall. There's two colons. Body, a Tentacle Mess, the Grotesque and the Weird, the Fall.
That's
two
like
colons.
The full name of the game Dwarf Fortress. Called Slaves to Armok 2, Dwarf Fortress, Tales of, and then random number generator.
Yeah, Body, a Tentacle Mess comes from a song we're going to investigate extensively, the NWRA. However, we do not start with Mark Fisher. We start from a quote by Patrick Perrinder in his book James Joyce from 1984, from Chapter 1, James Joyce and the Grotesque. The word grotesque derives from a type of Roman ornamental design first discovered in the 15th century during the excavation of Titus's baths. Named after the grottos in which they were found, the new forms consisted of human and animal shapes intermingled with foliage, flowers, and fruits in fantastic designs which bore no relationship to the logical categories of classic art. So yeah, that's defining the grotesque.
Yeah, and he goes on to define the grotesque as essentially they were these like strange forms of like combined human, animal, and vegetal in, for lack of a better word, weird ways, and that the academics, etc., of the time could not really define them within the conventions of classical art theory, and therefore they were sort of created as this other.
Yep. And so, before we start with Mark Fisher's section, I will point out that this is like a collage of 3 parts of an essay that he did on K-Punk. The essay is called Memorex for the Kraken, the Fall's Pulp Modernism, and you can read the whole thing in K-Punk, and we might revisit that in a later season.
Well, yeah, it definitely feels like this should be maybe a special episode, but frankly, we kind of discovered this K-Punk article this morning, and feels like a thing we should like put some time into, because it's a very extensive essay.
Right, but it collages, and there's a certain grotesqueness and weirdness to the way he collages the different parts of the essays.
Yeah, sure.
So, starting out with the definition of the grotesque, and he refers back to the previous chapter on H.G. Wells, where he says that the door in the wall is an example of the melancholic weird, and the grotesque is in a relationship with the weird. And why is the grotesque in a relationship with the weird? Because the grotesque also evokes something which is out of place, but unlike someone like H.P. Lovecraft, the grotesque elicits laughter, or has a laughable quality to it, or has a presence with laughter that other forms of the weird does not.
I mean, I think the way to think about it is, as you said, the Fisher definition of the weird that we're going with is this thing that is outside that ought not be here, and yet it is here, and your brain has to handle the fact that it exists despite that it shouldn't. And he's sort of defining the grotesque in this particular way of the presence of humor in something inherently non-humorous, or like that the laughable element is the thing that ought not to be there, and yet it is sort of how I kind of gathered that.
Yeah, I think there's a revolting quality, but there's also something funny about the revulsion. And Lovecraft's humor is accidental, where I think that with something grotesque, there's intentionality to be, at the very least, sardonic.
I mean, to be clear, the unintentional humor of Lovecraft is us saying, wow, this level of racism ought not be here, and yet it is. That's kind of funny. What did he name his cat? That's hilarious.
Yeah, we all know about the cat.
I will mention the cat like once every episode, but never go into it more. You all have Google. The other way, I'm kind of thinking about it when I just hear the word grotesque. I think about, Fisher doesn't mention this is me. I think about, your old school freak shows of, essentially physically deformed people that were there to elicit shock, but also kind of laughter, also kind of revulsion, but also kind of laughter. And that was generally, they used the word grotesque to describe that. They were often called like a gallery of the grotesque or something like that. So, that's the other kind of way I'm sort of thinking about his use of the word humor here, but
yeah. To jump ahead a little bit, I think to give some grounding for what Fisher's talking about, he says about the album By the Fall from 1980, grotesque after the gram. There is certainly laughter here, a renegade form of parody and mockery that one hesitates to label satire, especially given the pallid and toothless form that satire has assumed in British culture in recent times.
Taking shots at Mitchell and Webb, Mark.
So, at the top of the episode, we played the song City Hobgoblins, and that's the first song that he really digs into, where he talks about the fall. But specifically, he identifies the period in which City Hobgoblins kind of exemplifies, which is between 1980 and 1982, which he and many of the fans of the band considered to be the golden years, the best years of the fall. Even in Memorax for the Kraken, he says, I didn't know it then when he discovered them in 1983, but their best years were behind them.
To be clear, this band went until essentially 2018.
Yeah.
Strong words from Mark Fisher, not necessarily from me, but you can listen to our other episode for...
Right. Join our Patreon and you'll get in an hour of us talking about Mark E. Smith, the lead singer of The Fall, and all of our thoughts on him as a person.
And also the rest of their career, essentially, after...
Yeah, this period. But here we're talking about 1980 to 1982. And specifically City Hobgoblins, in which we see, quote, an urban scene invaded by emigres from old green glades. A leering, malevolent kobold looms over a dilapidated tenement. But rather than being smoothly integrated into the photograph scene, the crudely rendered hobgoblin has been etched into the background. This is a war of the worlds, a little H.G. Wells reference, an ontological struggle, a struggle over the means of representation. From the point of view of the official bourgeois culture and its categories, a group like the Fall, working class, and experimental, popular, and modernist could not and should not exist, and the Fall are remarkable for their way in which they draw out a cultural politics of the weird and the grotesque. The Fall produced what could be called a popular modernist weird, wherein the weird shapes that form as the content of the work.
So you started by describing essentially the album cover.
Right, and we have the album cover up.
Yeah, I mean, it is as he described. It's essentially a photograph of a building, and then a crude childlike drawing a little goblin on top of the building. So, I mean, he mentions popular modernism. I think that's going to be a major topic of this episode. Essentially, it's a concept that has been introduced by Mark Fisher. This is basically his first use of it in a book that he released. He's used it previously in his writings, particularly the essay we referenced earlier. It's a fairly important concept. I think it's pretty well related to both capitalist realism and hauntology, so it really does tie into our previous seasons.
He also references it in Ghosts of My Life. So we have talked about it before, but I don't think we zeroed in on it. But he's addressing it here to discuss the Fall and as a popular modernist weirdness, specifically in the way that they create songs and they use references within their songs and how they have this mixture of low and high culture, which I think we'll get into.
Yeah.
And here's a quote by Mark Fisher.
About a relationship between experience and thought in a certain way that was extremely widespread in the 60s and afterwards. And you have to think about the scale of this. With this being led by people like the Beatles, nothing had been more famous than the Beatles up to that point, right? Nothing. So you've got a popular modernist culture, with something like the Beatles, who basically trained people to expect things to get more and more experimental the more popular they got, which is what happened with the Beatles for their peak years in the 60s. And what they mainstreamed was this psychedelic consciousness with its key notion of the plasticity of reality.
All right, so popular modernism is a concept that is near and dear to Mark Fisher's thought. There's a relationship to hauntology that I think we discussed.
So the layout, I'm definitely very much inspired by a video that we'll link by Jonas Cheka discussing popular modernism in the context of post-punk. I'm not trying to plagiarize his analysis and pass it off as my own. It is a video that I saw that I think explains it quite well, and I am using his framework, which is to say that it's against the notion of Adorno, essentially, talking about modernism and modernist art. And for Adorno, under capitalism, cultural production happens under his concept of the culture industry, of basically capitalist mechanical reproduction of culture using pre-established cultural forms devoid of that which makes culture meaningful, essentially. And he identified art as a thing that can exist outside of that, but inherent to that existence outside of the culture industry is elitism, is the fact that art is necessarily never going to be for the masses, because by eschewing the culture industry, it eschews its ability to be distributed to the masses. And Mark Fisher comes in essentially with this argument that in certain instances, you can actually have meaningful cultural production outside the culture industry that is also consumable by the masses. And this is a concept of popular modernism. So in that quote, he was discussing the Beatles, but he hones in, especially in this chapter, on post-punk, specifically The Fall, because as we discussed in our hauntology season even, these material conditions of, late social democratic England, financing public schooling, public housing, etc., you could have these artistic pursuits that don't necessarily need to immediately be tied to the market and could therefore exist for the sake of its own cultural production for use value, essentially. So that, I think, is a good way of thinking about popular modernism. He's going to use it in this chapter and apply it to The Fall.
Yeah, and its relationship with hauntology, as I alluded to before, is like hauntology is sort of trying to replicate the freedoms of popular modernism without having the social conditions that allow them to.
Right.
In some ways, and in other ways, experimental artists that are trying to be free and having similar conditions under which they make art, and trying to, again, capture the freedoms of experimentation that modernist art really pioneered in the 20th century, and that Mark Fisher sees that type of innovation on the decline, and we're subsumed by capitalist realism so much that we can't make anything new, and these attempts to innovate attempt to capture those similar modernist techniques and motifs.
Yeah, so to, briefly say hauntology, one of the concepts is we look back to look forward. And so one of the ideas is, in order to have a vision of the future, we can't form one today. We need to look back to the early 80s, say, and see what they thought the future was going to be like. And through that proxy, and also going on Adorno's idea of the culture industry, of essentially culture is produced by having these tried and true, tested cultural forms that we know will market well and slapping them together to make a new cultural product. Hauntology is sort of this echoing of taking those cultural forms without the different means of production and building a culture industry product kind of mimicking them in many ways.
So for Fisher and The Fall, he calls it pulp modernism, but also he uses it interchangeably with popular modernism, whereas the weird tale enters into becoming with the weirdness of modernism. Its unfamiliarity, its combination of elements previously held to be incommensurable, its compressions, its challenges to standard models of legibility, and with all the difficulties and compulsions of post-punk sound. So yeah, I think that is a good place for us to play. This is a song from their 1980 album, Grotesque After the Gram.
3 days, or 3 months, or 3 days, or 3 months, or treatise, to explain these. First was cash and carry house stands in Lancashire that
Alright, so yeah, that's one of the longer songs, C&C Smithering, which is carry in containers, and mithering is a slang word. It has a lot of references throughout the song. There's a play, S. Smithering is like his name in there. He has a sense of humor about it, and I think the song is kind of a skewering of all the people who he thinks are posers in the music industry. And Fisher talks about the way he tells the story, which is that it comes together in these fractured ways. The songs on Grotesque are tales, but tales half told. The words are fragmentary, as if they have come to us via an unreliable transmission that keeps cutting out. Viewpoints are garbled. Ontological distinctions between author, text, and character are confused and fractured. It is impossible to definitively sort out the narrator's words from direct speech. The tracks are palimpsests, badly recorded in a deliberate refusal of the coffee table aesthetic that the group's leader, Marky Smith, derides on the cryptic sleeve notes. He loves his sleeve notes. As you can hear, it's very raw, kind of reminds me of like lo-fi attempts at making at-home recordings with a full band where you're getting not a full production value that you're used to, and that's very intentional. He says it's like the process of the recording is not airbrushed out, but foregrounded, surface hiss, and illegible cassette noise brandished like improvised stitching on some Hammer Frankenstein monster. The track Impression of J. Temperance was typical, a story in the Lovecraft style in which the dog breeder's hideous replica stalks Manchester. This is a weird tale, but one subjected to modernist techniques of compression and collage. The result is so elliptical that it is as if the text, part obliterated by silt, mildew, and algae, has been fished out of the Manchester Ship Canal, which Steve Hanley's bass sounds like it is dredging. He's talking about the form. I'll play a little bit of that song. Yeah, that bass is certainly dredgy.
Yes, he mentioned City Hobgoblins again as having a quick reference to Ubi which is a French play that apparently it's a proto-datist, proto-surrealist play from the late 19th century. And he's kind of getting around this idea of this combination of these, simple rock beats, essentially, plus this high intellectualism, high literariness, which is kind of what, what he's discussing with the popular modernism.
Right. Ubi was performed once, I believe in 1899. It was considered so offensive because it was a parody of Macbeth, where it was just a romp on stage. I think the woman tried to get her husband to kill the king of Poland, and then he becomes the king. It's a whole thing. But it was an early version of
theater of the absurd.
Yeah, theater of the absurd.
It gets kind of rolled in seemingly with it prefigures surrealism, dadaism, theater of the absurd.
Right.
But yeah, he says here, the sound on Grotesque is a seemingly impossible combination of the shambolic and the disciplined, the cerebral literary, and the idiotic physical. Good summary of what he's kind of trying to get at with this. And, again, to pull it back, we're in the section of the weird and eerie that's about the weird. So we're talking about this, what is there but shouldn't be there. So It's this combination that he's very much identifying as a form of the weird.
Yeah, and he makes one of these sweeping statements that kind of reminds me of his days, at least my recollection of us doing Ghosts of My Life, where he just makes these glorious sweeping statements. We could go so far as to say that it is the human condition to be grotesque, since the human animal is the one that does not fit in, the freak of nature who has no place in the natural order and is capable of recombining nature's products into hideous new forms.
Maybe you, but I'm built different. I belong.
And then he goes off and says that the Fall is trying to imagine what if rock and roll was made in England instead of America.
It would be the most comically racist thing you could imagine. Yeah, what if rock had less to do with black people? How would that be?
Yeah, and he answers it almost immediately. What if rock and roll had emerged from the industrial heartlands of England rather than the Mississippi Delta? The rockabilly on Grotesque is slowed by meat pies and gravy, which I don't know what exactly that means.
I mean, I don't know what the fuck he thinks people in the goddamn South Mississippi Delta fucking eat.
Yeah.
Like, they also eat meat and gravy. It's like a different, better meat and gravy.
And they move slow, too.
Yeah, I mean, all those things are true.
The what if speculation fails, obviously. Rock and roll needed the endless open highways. It could never have begun in England's snarled up ring roads and claustrophobic conurbations.
Again, this sounds like a man who's never been to the Mississippi Delta, which, to be fair, neither have I, but I can imagine it pretty good.
The yet unborn sons of the North will rise again. The North will rise again. Not in 10,000 years. Not in 10,000 years. Too many people, cowards and criminals, and government crap. These things stick up like snacks.
Probably my favorite song of theirs. I just get "The North Will Rise Again" stuck in my head as a constant thing that gets me through the day. The North will rise again. He also thinks very highly of this song. It's a good one.
It's literally the brainchild of T.S. Eliot, Wyndham Lewis, H.G. Wells, Philip K. Dick, Lovecraft, and Le Carre. God damn it.
Le Carre, we've been corrected.
Okay, well, I'm not going to respect that by Yeah, I mean, again, we're getting into the popular modernism, the high literary influences that are behind this brash, garage rocky fucking band that he loves so much.
What's interesting about this song is it takes the persona from Roman Total, which is one of Marky Smith's alter ego, but then he's like, it's not really his alter ego, it's just kind of a projection of an alternative version of himself.
Kilgore Trout for Kurt Vonnegut, I think, is
He compares it to Randolph Carter for Lovecraft.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm more familiar with your Vonnegut, Kilgore Trout, if anyone's familiar with that, but also, I suppose, Randolph Carter, Lovecraft, although I incidentally have not read a single goddamn Randolph Carter story of Lovecraft in all my Lovecraft readings, but sure.
He has, I think it's in 7 of his short stories.
Yeah, and a lot of them are in the dream cycle, not the Cthulhu mythos, so it's a whole fucking thing.
But there's specifically these lyrics that sound very Lovecraftian. Mm-hmm. And that's what he sort of focuses in on. The character of Roman Total is a psychic and former cabaret performer, which goes back to what you said about the Grotesque and cabaret and the freak shows, whose body is covered in tentacles. And there's this lyric, so our Total dwells underground, away from sickly grind, with ostrich headdress full of mess, covered in feathers, orange-red with blue-black lines that drape down to his chest, body a tentacle mess, and light blue plants heads. The words kind of stumble over each other.
And also for, what was the other song of theirs that actually makes kind of a seeming explicit reference to Dunwich Horror?
Yeah, called Spectre vs. Rector.
Yeah, so in that song, another of theirs we listened to, there's a very explicit reference to Yog Shoggoth, the monster from Dunwich Horror. Evidently, this group does make actually a lot of very explicit Lovecraftian references, not just, it's spooky tentacle imagery, but oftentimes specific stories.
The lyrics from that, which are talked about in Memorax for the Kraken, M.R. James, be born, Yog Sargoth, rape me lord, Sludge Hai Choi, Van Greenway, R. Corman. It's like he's almost doing a spell from
Yeah, the Necronomicon.
Necronomicon.
Yeah, with explicit, I mean, for reference, Dunwich Horror is the one, essentially the Rosemary's Baby one, but Yog Sagoth is the devil to the, giving birth to the son of the devil. It's Yog Sagoth's son that gets born in that book, and this is seemingly an incantation to Rosemary's Baby, a woman in that context.
Yeah, it also references M.R. James, which we're going to get to in a later chapter. Mm-hmm. But back to NWRA, he then says, it is like Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, rewritten by the Joyce of Ulysses and compressed into 10 minutes. Which is one of my favorite lines of
Jesus Christ.
High modernist praise for the fall.
Yeah, it's like if Cthulhu was rewritten by Joyce, but you know how Joyce is very succinct and brief about things?
He's not.
No, but that's my point. Like, compressed into 10 minutes. It's like, it's rewritten by Joyce except for the thing you know about Joyce. It doesn't have that part. But the rest of it's like Joyce. No.
Also, questionable attitudes towards the Irish.
Yeah, but Joyce gets to. He had to live with those people.
So, more than a matter of regional railing against the capital, in Smith's vision, the North comes to stand for everything suppressed by urbane good taste. The esoteric, the anomalous, the vulgar sublime, that is to say, the weird and the grotesque itself. What a great line, Mark Fisher. He also uses a great word in the next sentence, festooned. Total, festooned in the incongruous, grotesque costume of ostrich headdress, feathers, orange, red, and blue-black lines. He compares it to the fairy king and the weird revolt, which, reminds him of a pulp modernist version of Miss Havisham. Great Expectations, Pip goes to work for Miss Havisham, and she's like this old woman who's living in the past and very ghostly and grotesque herself. And so Pip, she's super wealthy, and so she does kind of take on this. She's very grotesque.
I've only ever seen the South Park parody of Great Expectations, which is actually a very detailed, I don't even think it stands within any context of the kids are on an adventure that happens to fall into the plot. They literally just do Great Expectations. It's a very weird episode of South Park.
Yeah, well, but, you're a high-cultured individual.
That's my pop modernism.
We come back to they're doing psychotropic drugs, and he becomes a visionary leader, and then he goes back to being a cabaret. And that's sort of like the anticlimactic story that's being told. So, that was all that he really talks about in this essay about the grotesque. And next up, we will get into his discussion of Hex Induction.
Hex Induction Hour.
Hex Induction Hour by the Fall, which I saw an interview with him, and he's like, yeah, it's a word that I made up, and it's also an hour long, and Hex means 6, and it's our 6th album.
Sure.
Yeah, so this is Hip Priest, which incidentally also has him being like a charismatic leader, self-described Hip Priest.
That's purple psychology, and not just an old lady.
Alright, so Hex Induction Hour came out after Grotesque, after the Gram in 1982, and it was, as our good friend John, who was in our Patreon episode, told us, supposed to be the last album by the band, so they put more effort into conceptualizing it, and it's also considered probably their best album by a lot of their fans.
Yeah, for someone like Mark Fisher who thinks their, highlight was 80 to 82, this would be kind of the last good album of theirs,
Right.
basically.
Before he married his wife and turned the band into another punk band.
Yeah, sure he did. They sounded slightly more like Joy Division.
Or more like Iggy Pop and the Stooges.
Yeah.
He compares it more to M.R. James again, which we mentioned before, specifically on the song Jawbone and the Air Rifle, which he compares to M.R. James' tale, A Warning to the Curious, and Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which we will talk about on a later episode. And we watched that short 45-minute movie about the guy who has the ghost. It was like a BBC 45-minute, hour-long, and it's like in black and white, and he goes to the seaside and walks along the beach, and there's a ghost that he thinks he keeps seeing, and he starts going mad as a result of it.
Right, okay.
And that will be brought up again in the chapter on Vanishing Land, M.R. James and Brian Eno, which are about the lovely British beaches that we all love. So he says, M.R. James' tales and Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth, and to Hammer Horror and The Wicker Man, which we've mentioned before on the season. Quote, he sees jawbones on the street, advertisements become carnivores, the road workers turn into jawbones, and he has visions of islands heavily covered in slime. The villagers dance round prefabs and laugh through twisted mouths. Here again, he brings attention to they're like a British comedy group or a carnival, and that there's multiple references to weird tales.
Well, I mean, just what he mentioned, you got your Wicker Man, like this kind of evocation of like cultic dances, but it's around prefab homes. Shadow over Innsmouth, the other thing that he referenced, again, this sort of spooky town where everyone's in the same cult together, but this insertion of isn't the real monster like commercialism and modernism, kind of the idea with those lyrics.
Right. He sees jawbones on the street. Advertisements become carnivores.
Mm-hmm.
And Marky Smith, whenever you see interviews with him, he'll frequently be railing against the music industry and people who sell out.
Yeah, and people who are mean to him on the internet.
Yes. Oh my God. We go over that again in our other episode, but he got super angry at Facebook.
Because people made fun of him on Facebook. Not because,
there were people that imitated him, and they, made up accounts that weren't him, and then he saw it, and he wrote an entire album.
I mean, I just feel like if you're gonna, impersonate a celebrity, you'd impersonate, a rich celebrity who probably has, a line of credit, rather than someone who lives in Prestwich. That's it. This is a man who lived in a place called Prestwich his entire life, even after becoming, a famous person. And, just as, this exercise of British nationalism, insistently ate the same fucking 3 meals of fish and chips every goddamn day. And I just imagine, impersonating him, to, be able to rip off the Newsies or something, get some newspapers under his name and charge his account to it. I don't imagine those guys buying private jets, really. Yeah, he got very angry at Facebook, wrote anti-Facebook songs, and you think, when you hear that from, an artist like this, you think, he's angry at the commercialism, the alienation, this, that, and the other thing. He seems, based on his interviews, mostly angry that people were annoying him on the internet some way or another.
Yeah, and also made the claim that most people in England didn't want computers.
Yeah, he literally claimed in between the years of 2013 and 2016, he made an offhanded claim that he's speaking for the common man because obviously he said over half. He wasn't like he was very specific. He said over half of people in England had nothing to do with computers, did not use computers, wanted nothing to do with computers, and he's normal because he's like that.
Well, I just like thinking that he conducted the poll himself, that he walked around Prestwich and sat down next to random people in pubs and just asked them, hey, do you like using the internet? And he found somebody that was like, no. And then he moved on to someone else. And then...
Not even just doesn't like, but doesn't use at all. It really went from people were mean to him on Facebook to I'm writing anti-Facebook songs, and also, in fact, no one uses computers. Who fucking uses computers? That's literally his attitude. Just immediately universalizing the fact that he was angry at someone on Facebook to computers are mostly a passing fad in the year 2015.
The beer festival. For the beer festival? Will you play there?
Yeah. If we can, if we're capable.
You recorded a track called Iceland, and I believe you did that in Iceland.
Yeah,
am I correct?
Bit, yeah.
Did you only go to Iceland to record that one track, or did you go there to do a tour of Iceland?
We did 3 nights in Reykjavik. Played 3 nights, and somebody just booked the studio for us.
So you fellas really don't look ahead and say, hey, we will...
So the last paragraph of this is about the track Iceland, which we're going to play as the outro of this episode. And one of the criticisms of the band that he's responded to in interviews is that all the songs sound the same, and this is the one I think that we've gone over that sounds the most different. It's almost an ambient track. He compares it to Nico's The Marble Index. And yeah, it's about the fading myths of North European cultures. He says they recorded in a lava-lined studio in Reykjavik, which...
The most fucking
yeah,
Burzum-ass shit.
It sounds awesome.
It sounds like a fucking Norwegian black metal project that they would do, except they would never go to Iceland for nationalist reasons.
And here he mentions that over the course of these albums, the laughter's kind of gone. Especially on this track, he says, here the grotesque laughter is gone. The song, hypnotic and undulating, meditative and mournful, recalls the bone-white steps of Nico's The Marble Index in its Arctic atmospherics. A keening wind whips through the track as Smith invites us to cast the runes against your own soul. Another M.R. James reference, this time to his story, Casting the Runes. Iceland is a twilight of the idols for the retreating hobgoblins, kobolds and trolls of Europe's receding weird culture, a lament for the monstrosities and myths whose dying breath it captures on tape. And then the last quote, witness the last of the god men, a memorax for the krakens.
They come from the land of ice and snow.
That is correct. Well, that's our episode about the fall. For more of Marlowe's opinions about the British people, go check out the Patreon episode with our friend John. It's been fun getting to know the fall. It's been fun talking to you about it. Next week, we're going to go over Tim Powers, and it'll be my turn to be angry at the fact that I had to read it. Caught in the Coils of Ouroboros, Tim Powers and his novel Anubis Gate.
Yep.
All right, see you next week.
A plate steel object was fired, and I did not feel for my compatriots. Hated even the core of myself. Not a matter of ill health. It was fear of weakness deep in core of myself. The fact attainment was out of